The morning without a spoon. The emperor of the Eastern Kingdom awoke as he always did, slowly, with dignity, and with a faint sound of doves in the palace courtyard cooing as though they too served him. The golden light of dawn touched the silk canopy above his bed. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and decided, as emperors often do, that it was time for breakfast. Breakfast in the palace was never hurried. Trays of warm rice, bowls of fragrant broth, and fruits, neatly sliced into delicate patterns, were arranged with the precision of generals on a battlefield. And always, always, by his side, there was a spoon of silver polished, until it held the morning sun like a second little dawn. But on this particular morning, when the emperor reached out for his familiar companion, his hand closed on nothing but air. The spoon was gone. At first he thought perhaps he had slept oddly and nudged it onto the floor. He looked. No spoon. Perhaps a servant had polished it too thoroughly and it had vanished into invisibility. No spoon. The emperor sat upright. For a man whose armies could cross mountains, whose treasury overflowed with gold, the absence of one silver spoon was a curious disturbance. He cleared his throat. A servant hurried forward. "Where is my spoon?" the emperor asked calmly. The servant blinked. "Which spoon, your radiance?" "The spoon," said the emperor, as though there could be no other. The palace trembled with quiet confusion. Cooks in the kitchen were questioned. Chamberlains scurried down corridors, and advisors suggested bringing one of the many other spoons. In the imperial collection, there were dozens, even hundreds in jeweled boxes. But the emperor shook his head. "It is not any spoon," he said. "It is my spoon, the one I have used every morning since I cannot even recall. Without it, my rice will taste strange, my broth unbalanced. The day will lean crookedly." And so while the food grew a little cooler, the entire palace began to murmur about the missing spoon. Some said it was stolen. Others said it had walked away. One guard swore he had seen a cat carrying something shiny in the courtyard. The emperor, meanwhile, leaned back and considered. Perhaps the spoon was not lost, but simply absent like the moon in the day sky, hidden, waiting for its hour. Perhaps this was not misfortune, but a kind of lesson. For the first time in many years, the emperor lifted a bowl of rice to his lips and ate without a spoon. The grains stuck to his fingers, and the warmth surprised him. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. "It is a strange thing," he said aloud, "to eat without what I thought was necessary. Perhaps the spoon is reminding me of something I have forgotten." The servants looked at one another nervously, but the emperor only smiled faintly, as though the missing spoon were already telling him secrets. And thus, in the quiet morning light, with no silver utensil in sight, the mystery of the missing spoon began. The kitchen without a spoon. The palace kitchens were never truly silent. Even in the deepest hours before dawn, there was the faint crackle of charcoal, the steady drip of water from jars, and the soft rustle of cloth as sleepy attendants checked on their work. But on this morning, when word spread that the emperor's silver spoon had gone missing, the kitchens became a place of restless whispers. At first, no one believed it. A spoon, after all, was such a small thing compared to the treasures of an empire. Golden statues, jeweled crowns, scrolls of wisdom. Yes, these might be guarded with ceremony and fear of theft. But a spoon, even if silver, surely it could not stir such commotion. Yet here they were, cooks and bakers, servants and tasters, all glancing nervously toward the doorway, as if the absence of one piece of cutlery might unravel the entire order of the palace. The head cook, a stout woman with arms stronger than most soldiers, stood with a ladle in hand as though it were a weapon. "The emperor takes his morning broth with that spoon," she said firmly, as if this fact alone was equal to divine law. "If the spoon is gone, how is he to begin the day? And if the day begins wrongly, who can say how it will end?" Around her, the younger cooks nodded gravely. They had all seen the emperor lift that spoon countless times. It was not merely an instrument for eating, it was a ritual, the first gesture of nourishment before the rest of the palace awoke. A missing spoon to them was like a temple bell that refused to ring. Meanwhile, the bakers clucked their tongues and whispered among themselves. They insisted it was bad luck. If the spoon was truly lost, perhaps a famine was coming. Perhaps the spirits of the hearth were displeased. Perhaps the emperor, mighty as he was being reminded of something important by forces larger than men. In the corner, the young scullion boy, who scrubbed pots and fetched water, dared to speak. Maybe he said timidly, "The emperor does not need the spoon. Maybe he will drink his broth from the bowl." At this, the room fell silent, and every pair of eyes turned toward him. Drink from the bowl. The thought was shocking, even dangerous. Such a thing might be common in huts and cottages, but in the palace, for the emperor himself, the head cook thumped her ladle against a pot for emphasis. The emperor is not a goat boy. He will not lap at his food. Still her voice carried less certainty than before, for in truth no one knew what the emperor would do. Upstairs, the emperor sat calmly on his cushioned chair. Before him was a simple bowl of millet broth, fragrant with onions and herbs. The steam rose in elegant curls, yet beside it on the small tray lay only an empty space where the silver spoon should have rested. He looked at the broth, then at the gap, and then back at the broth. His attendants fidgeted ready to dash off at his smallest command, but the emperor raised no complaint. Instead, he tilted his head as though the missing spoon had posed him a riddle. "A spoon is only a small bridge," he murmured softly between food and mouth. "Without it, the food is no less nourishing, the mouth is no less hungry." The attendants glanced at one another. Was this wisdom, or simply a gentle acceptance? Either way, none dared interrupt. The emperor then cupped the bowl carefully in his hands. The porcelain was warm, almost comforting, and slowly, deliberately, he lifted the bowl to his lips and drank. The broth was simple, earthy, familiar. Without the spoon, it reached him differently with more immediacy. It was less ceremony, more presence. He felt the warmth on his palms, smelled the herbs more closely, and tasted the grain with deeper attention. When he set the bowl down again, there was quiet in the room. The attendants, still nervous, expected angers or at least a command to search every corner of the palace, but instead the emperor only smiled faintly. "The spoon has gone on a journey," he said. "Let it wander. We too shall wander a little without it." Back in the kitchen, the scullion boy scrubbed a pot and wondered if perhaps the emperor had indeed drunk directly from the bowl. He imagined it the most powerful man in the land, tilting his bowl like a farmer at rest. The thought was both unsettling and oddly comforting. Perhaps, he mused, spoons were not as necessary as everyone believed. And so the kitchens continued their bustle. Bread rose, meats roasted, jars clinked. But beneath it all, a quiet question lingered. If the emperor could eat without a spoon, what other things might prove less necessary than they seemed? The craftsmen and their spoons. The palace courtyard was unusually busy that morning. Normally, the artisans of the court worked quietly at their benches, fashioning delicate trinkets for the treasury, repairing handles for ceremonial fans, or polishing bronze mirrors to a shine. Today, however, a call had gone out from the emperor himself. The silver spoon must be found, or at least replaced. And so the spoon makers, the metal workers, and even the wood carvers assembled in the open shade of the colonnade, each with their tools wrapped in cloth rolls, each curious and faintly nervous. The emperor had not shouted. He never shouted. He had merely sighed, smiled faintly, and said, "Perhaps the craftsman may enlighten us about the matter of spoons." That was enough. The master silversmith, a round-bellied man with a bald head and gentle eyes, stepped forward first. He held up a small ladle, as though it were evidence. Your radiance, he said, a spoon is no trivial object. It is a bridge between the bowl and the lips. Without it, the dignity of eating is interrupted. The emperor raised an eyebrow. Interrupted, I drank my broth this morning without difficulty. No bridge was required. A ripple of polite laughter passed among the assembled craftsmen, though a few muttered that the emperor's lips were perhaps less burned than their own would be if they tried the same. The wood carver spoke next. He was thin and wiry, with hands that always carried the scent of cedar. If silver spoons may vanish, perhaps it is a sign that wood is the answer. A wooden spoon never gleams too brightly. It stays humble. It is light in the hand, and it floats in water if dropped. A trustworthy companion. Until it cracks, muttered the silversmith, unable to help himself. Until it tarnishes, replied the wood carver, tilting his head. The emperor smiled faintly. It amused him that spoons should be debated like generals at war. From the back of the group came a small cough. The palace bronze worker, whose trade was usually more concerned with hinges and door bolts than delicate tableware, shuffled forward. His hands were stained a permanent green from years of copper. If I may, your radiance. Bronze spoons endure longer than either silver or wood. They are not so precious that a thief would covet them, nor so fragile that they split. They clink most agreeably against a pot. The cooks in the kitchen, listening from the doorway, nodded in agreement. They knew the honest clink of bronze well. Yeah. And then came the glassblower, who, strictly speaking, was not required at all. But he had heard of the gathering and could not resist. He held aloft a fragile, shimmering thing, clear as water, and so thin it trembled in the air, a glass spoon. Majesty, he announced proudly, imagine the wonder of seeing your food through the utensil itself. Imagine broth glowing amber, lifted in pure transparency. The entire assembly leaned closer. The spoon caught the sunlight and looked like a frozen drop of rain. The emperor regarded it thoughtfully, then asked, and what happens when it falls? The glassblower cleared his throat. Then, Majesty, it ceases to be a spoon and becomes many spoons very small. Even the emperor chuckled at that. Ah, ma. The debate continued well into the afternoon. Each craftsman extolled not only his material, but the philosophy behind it. To choose silver was to value refinement and purity. To choose wood was to prefer humility and nature. To choose bronze was to honor durability and common sense. To choose glass was to chase beauty, even at the risk of fragility. And so the emperor listened. He asked gentle questions. Did a spoon carry more than food? Did it also carry meaning? Was it merely a tool or a companion of meals? If spoons could speak, what tales might they tell of soups, porridges, and stews, long forgotten? The craftsmen left that day, not with orders, but with something stranger, a feeling that the missing spoon had opened a small door in their minds. They returned to their workshops to ponder spoons as if they were poets instead of artisans. The emperor, meanwhile, ate his evening rice with chopsticks. He found them perfectly satisfactory. That night, as the palace grew quiet, the emperor sat by the lamplight and wrote a single sentence on a scroll. A spoon is not merely silver, nor wood, nor bronze, nor glass. A spoon is a pause between hunger and satisfaction, a servant of the humble and the great alike. And he wondered whether the missing spoon had truly been lost, or whether it had simply departed on some secret errand of its own. With that thought, he set down his brush, smiled faintly, and drifted into sleep. The spoon of the gods. Morning light slipped through the high, narrow windows of the temple, painting the stone floor in soft bands of gold and shadow. The emperor entered quietly, his robes trailing the faintest whisper against the flagstones. He had not yet found his silver spoon, Days had passed without it, but his steps were unhurried. Loss had a way of softening into ritual, especially here in the sacred hall. The priests already assembled bowed low. Their linen robes smelled faintly of incense and old papyrus. They had heard the news the emperor's spoon was gone, and in a palace where even the movement of stars was recorded, such an absence could not be considered trivial. Objects in a palace were rarely just objects. Each thing, whether spoon, sandal, or seal, could become a sign, a message from the gods. The high priest, his voice a rustle of parchment, welcomed the emperor. Majesty, he said, the missing of a spoon is no small matter, for food is sacred, and the vessel that carries food to the mouth is as important as the mouth itself. The emperor inclined his head. And yet, high priest, I have eaten without it. The broth was no less nourishing, though my lips met the bowl instead of silver. This answer made the younger priests exchange cautious glances. To them, spoons were not mere conveniences, but extensions of cosmic order. In the temple kitchens, wooden spoons stirred offerings of barley porridge for the gods. In the rituals, ladles of bronze poured libations. Even the smallest measure of oil, of wine, of honey was always given with a utensil. To lift food directly without such a vessel felt perilously close to disrespect. The high priest spread his hands. Majesty, perhaps the gods themselves have borrowed your spoon to remind us of humility. Perhaps they wish you to know hunger differently without mediation. The emperor's lips curved in a small smile. If the gods have taken my spoon, I hope they enjoy it. May their hands find it comfortable as mine once did. The priests chuckled nervously. They were not accustomed to thinking of deities dining at their own table, spoon in hand, yet the emperor's tone was gentle, not mocking. They led him deeper into the temple, where offerings were prepared. Rows of small clay bowls held fruits, grains, and herbs. A great copper cauldron steamed in the corner. Here spoons abounded, long-handled ladles for scooping broth, flat wooden paddles for stirring gruel, small carved spoons of ivory for mixing sacred ointments. The emperor paused before them. He saw that each spoon bore the mark of hands, burnished by use, darkened by smoke, or smoothed by countless stirrings. They were humble, ordinary things, yet in them lived continuity, a way to measure, to serve, to share. Every spoon is a bridge, the emperor said softly, between the pot and the bowl, between hunger and fullness, between gift and gratitude. The priests nodded solemnly, as though the phrase were scripture. A young novice, braver than the rest, dared to ask Majesty, does the absence of your spoon trouble you in your heart? The emperor thought for a moment. At first, yes, for it was familiar and habit is dear. But perhaps this loss is a teaching. The gods remind me that I am not fed by silver, nor comforted by shape and polish. I am fed by grain, by broth, by the unseen patience of those who stir and ladle. Perhaps the spoon was too proud of itself, and so it went walking. The priests laughed more freely now. Even the high priest's severe mouth curved upward. Before he departed, the emperor lifted one of the temple's wooden spoons and examined it. It was plain, a little cracked at the handle, dark with years of porridge, yet holding it gave him an unexpected sense of steadiness. Not everything needed to shine. He set it down again with respect. If my spoon wishes to return, it will. If not, I see there are spoons enough in this world. That evening, as he dined once more, by lifting broth to his lips directly from the bowl, he thought of the temple spoons. The polished silver one might have been lost, but the world remained filled with spoons, wooden, bronze, clay, ivory, each carrying small meanings. And somewhere perhaps the gods themselves were lifting a spoon, tasting what it meant to be both hungry and content. And with that thought, the emperor felt quietly full even before the meal was done. Spoons in the garden. The palace gardens were never in a hurry. They followed the pace of sun and season of soil and water. Even the gardeners moved slowly, bent over rows of herbs, or crouched near the orange trees as if afraid to disturb the air with sudden motions. It was here in the green shade of pomegranates and the soft trickle of a marble fountain that the emperor wandered one afternoon, still without his silver spoon. He had taken to walking in the gardens more often since the spoon had vanished. The loss was no longer a matter of palace gossip alone. It had become, in its own curious way, a gentle companion. He wondered, not for the first time, if the spoon had simply slipped away to rest in the roots of some fig tree or to catch sunlight among the reeds near the pond. The gardeners, who were practical men with soil beneath their nails, greeted him with respectful bows that were more like nods of shared understanding. They had heard of the missing spoon, of course everyone had, but they were less troubled by it than the priests or silversmiths had been. To them, spoons were tools like trowels and watering cans. Useful, yes, but not mysterious. The emperor paused beside a raised bed of herbs, basil thyme, and a few sprigs of mint already perfuming the air. Tell me, he asked the head gardener, a stooped man with a face like a walnut shell, do you ever think of spoons when you plant? The gardener chuckled softly, scratching his cheek with a muddy finger. Spoon's majesty. Only when I use one to measure out seeds or water for delicate roots. A spoon is a small cup with a handle. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, said the emperor, looking at a leaf trembling in the breeze, without my spoon broth tastes different. Food enters me differently. Do spoons shape what they hold as soil shapes the seed? The gardener tilted his head, considering. Soil matters, yes, but a seed is itself. A spoon may carry the broth, but the broth is the broth. Perhaps it is the emperor who gives meaning to the spoon, not the other way around. This was the kind of plain, sturdy wisdom the emperor liked best. He thanked the gardener, who bowed again and went back to trimming rosemary, snipping patiently as if clipping time itself. Farther down the path, he came to the orchard. Children of the kitchen staff were gathering fallen fruit, their little baskets filled with apples and apricots. They looked up, startled, to see the emperor, but he smiled and pointed at the fruit. Would you eat an apricot with a spoon? He asked them. One boy shook his head firmly. No, Majesty, I bite it. Another girl held up her small wooden spoon. But I mash it first, then eat it. Otherwise it drips. The emperor laughed gently, the sound like a breeze through leaves. The children's answers reminded him that spoons were not just for formality, nor only for silver and ceremony. They were also for small hands and sticky mouths, for ordinary sweetness. At the pond, carp swam lazily in golden arcs beneath the surface. The emperor crouched and watched them, the water rippling like polished metal. He thought how a spoon dipped here would lift not broth, but reflections of fish of sky of himself. Wasn't that another kind of nourishment, to feed the mind with shimmering images instead of food? As the sun slid lower, painting the garden path in honeyed light, the emperor rested on a stone bench. Birds flitted above him, carrying twigs for their nests. He thought of how even they, in their tiny beaks, carried food or twigs as if with invisible spoons. Nature itself had invented countless ways of scooping, carrying, feeding. The missing silver spoon no longer seemed absent. It had multiplied, in a sense, into every gesture of garden and creature around him. A ladle of water, a curved leaf, a child's wooden scoop, a bird's beak. All were spoons, each holding its little portion of the world. When twilight deepened, the emperor rose. He had not found his silver spoon, but he had gathered something else, the knowledge that spoons were not bound only to tables and kitchens. They lived in gardens, in orchards, in rivers and skies. His heart felt lighter, as though the missing spoon were still close by, only disguised in 100 humbler shapes. That night he ate supper quietly from a bowl of lentil stew. Still no silver spoon, only a plain wooden one set before him. Yet as he lifted it, he imagined the garden leaves, the children's laughter, the carp's rippling arcs, and the stew, carried so simply, tasted fuller than ever before. He slept well, dreaming of spoons made of petals and clouds. The Library of Spoons. The palace library was always cool and shadowed, even when the summer sun pressed hard against the whitewashed walls outside. The emperor liked to come here on quiet afternoons when his sandals made the faintest whisper across the tiled floor and the air carried the faint, dry perfume of old papyrus. Since his silver spoon had vanished, he had been visiting the library more often. If the kitchen had shown him the practical panic of a missing utensil and the workshops had revealed the pride of craft, then perhaps the library might hold the wisdom of ages' stories of spoons gone missing before, or the philosophy of eating itself. The chief librarian, a thin man with a long nose and an even longer memory, bowed so low that his spine creaked. He led the emperor to a broad cedar table upon which were already piled several scrolls. Majesty, he said gravely, we have gathered references to spoons from our records. Some are practical, some poetic, some puzzling. The emperor smiled. He liked puzzling things. The first scroll was unrolled carefully. It was a treatise on household management, written by a stern matron centuries earlier. In a tidy, unwavering hand, she had written, a spoon must not be too large, for the mouth is not a pot, nor too small, for the stomach is not a sparrow. Moderation is the virtue of the spoon. The emperor nodded thoughtfully. Moderation, he repeated. Even the spoon teaches balance. The next scroll was more whimsical, a collection of tavern songs. One verse declared somewhat boastfully, give me a spoon long as a spear, and I shall drink from the bottom of the jar without moving from my chair. The scribes tittered, and even the emperor allowed himself a small laugh. Another scroll spoke of spoons carved from ivory, used not for eating, but for offerings in the temple. Priests would place honey or milk in them as gifts to the gods, so even the gods received their sweetness by spoon, murmured the emperor. Perhaps my missing spoon has wandered into heaven's pantry. At this, the scribes exchanged glances, uncertain if they should laugh or bow. They settled on a cautious half smile, which the emperor found rather charming. Later in the afternoon, a young scholar nervously approached with a fresh parchment of his own. Majesty, he said, blushing, I have written a small poem on the subject. It is perhaps not very good. The emperor encouraged him to read it. The scholar's voice trembled. A spoon is not a sword, yet it conquers hunger daily. A spoon is not a crown, yet it rules the quiet table. A spoon is not eternal, yet it leaves its mark, one mouthful at a time. The library fell silent. The emperor closed his eyes for a moment as though tasting the words. When he opened them, he said simply, that is better than gold. Guard this poem well. By the time the lamps were lit, the emperor felt that his missing spoon was not a loss, but an opening, for in its absence he had discovered how many shapes a spoon could take: tool, offering, song, or poem. As he left the library, the cool stone beneath his hand, he thought, perhaps the spoon has not left me, perhaps it has multiplied. And so he returned to his chambers light of heart, ready for supper, whether served with a spoon or with none at all. The emperor's dinner, without a spoon. The evening meal in the palace had always followed the same unspoken rhythm. Silver plates gleamed, candles flickered with gentle obedience. At the center of it all, the emperor's silver spoon would rest on its folded napkin, waiting for the first lift of broth. But tonight, the napkin lay empty. The courtiers shifted uneasily as they sat down to this long, polished table. They pretended not to stare, though their eyes drifted again and again to the emperor's place. A golden bowl of steaming lentil stew gave off a comforting fragrance, yet it seemed somehow incomplete without the quiet presence of the silver spoon beside it. The emperor noticed, of course, he always noticed, but instead of summoning another silversmith or demanding the kitchen search again, He reached for a small object the servants had placed discreetly at his side, a humble clay spoon chipped at the edge and darkened with age. It looked almost embarrassed to be there among polished dishes, like a farmhand wearing sandals to a coronation. The courtiers' throats tightened. Some gasped softly. A few exchanged quick glances that said, "Surely His Majesty won't." But he did. The emperor dipped the clay spoon into the golden broth and lifted it to his lips. Steam curled, and he sipped slowly, closing his eyes. The taste was the same as ever: lentils, garlic, the faint tang of cumin, but somehow, without the silver spoon, the flavor seemed closer, warmer, less ceremonial, and more human. He smiled. The courtiers, uncertain, shifted again. The chancellor cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the clay spoon it is, most unusual for such a table." Unusual, the emperor agreed, letting the spoon rest lightly against the bowl, but not unworthy. A silence followed, deeper than the clinking of goblets or the shuffle of sandals. The emperor lifted another spoonful. The chipped edge scraped softly against the bowl's rim, a sound that seemed almost homely, as though the grand dining hall had become just for tonight a kitchen hearth. Gradually, the tension melted. A few courtiers tried their soup without fussing over their own gleaming spoons. One brave noble even asked if he might try eating without any spoon at all, tilting the bowl carefully to sip. There was laughter, gentle, nervous, but genuine. "Does the food not taste the same?" the emperor asked them, his eyes twinkling. "Perhaps it tastes even better now that the spoon does not distract." Some nodded, some frowned, but everyone felt a shift, subtle and undeniable. Dinner went on. The courtiers spoke less of politics and more of childhood suppers, of simple bowls at home before they had titles and robes. A general confessed that the chipped clay spoon reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen, where stew simmered forever on the hearth and spoons were passed down like heirlooms. Another courtier, usually severe, smiled shyly and admitted she had once eaten honey with her fingers because no spoon was at hand, and it had been the sweetest taste of her life. The emperor listened with quiet delight. He thought of how a single missing spoon had loosened the bindings of custom, allowing the meal to breathe. When the last of the stew was gone, he set the clay spoon gently on the napkin where the silver one used to rest. The courtiers rose, bowing as always, but their steps were softer, their voices warmer, as if the clay spoon had reminded them that beneath robes and duties, they were still simply people who needed to eat. That night, before retiring, the emperor held the clay spoon in his hand. He turned it slowly, studying the uneven glaze, the worn handle. It was imperfect, yes, but it had given the meal a soul. He placed it carefully in a small wooden box, as if it were a treasure. The silver spoon was still missing. Perhaps it would return, perhaps not. But tonight the emperor had discovered something just as precious, that even chipped clay could carry nourishment, memory, and comfort to the lips of an emperor. And with that thought, he slept, dreaming of kitchens where spoons were simple, food was humble, and every meal tasted of home. Sure. The music of spoons. Morning light drifted through the long windows of the palace hall, soft and golden as if poured from a ladle. The emperor sat quietly without his silver spoon, sipping a warm broth from a clay bowl. He did not seem bothered by the absence anymore. Rather, he found himself listening, not to words, not to the bustle of servants, but to sounds. There was the clatter of wooden ladles in the kitchens, the tap of a bronze ladle against the rim of a cauldron, the faint chime of porcelain bowls being stacked. Even the smallest sound, when he paid attention, seemed to have rhythm. The palace was full of tiny instruments, and the utensils of daily life had become musicians without realizing it. The emperor smiled. A thought came to him. Perhaps his spoon had not been stolen, nor truly lost, but had simply joined the orchestra of the world. Later that day, musicians arrived to rehearse for an evening performance. They carried their lutes, flutes, and drums into the grand hall. The emperor, curious, watched them unpack. A young musician tapped a bronze bowl with a wooden stick to test the echo. Another rubbed the back of a ladle with his finger, marveling at the note it produced. Soon, without meaning to, they were laughing and experimenting. Bowls, spoons, and cups became part of the rehearsal. The emperor clapped softly, delighted. Why not, he said, let the common tools of our meals be part of the music of our feasts. Let the ladles sing, let the spoons drum. And so it was. That evening, instead of the refined music of court alone, there was a new layer of sound, the chime of spoons against clay bowls, the soft thump of ladles on jars, the ringing of bronze cups struck together like bells. It was not perfect music. It was uneven, homely, sometimes silly, but it had a warmth the court had never heard before. As the emperor sat and listened, he noticed that no one missed his silver spoon anymore. In fact, its absence seemed to have given birth to something livelier. A polished silver spoon, too precious to strike against a pot, would never have joined this orchestra. Only the plain spoons, chipped bowls, and sturdy ladles had stepped forward to sing. The courtiers, at first stiff, eventually tapped their cups on the table in time with the rhythm. The cooks from the kitchens even joined in shaking bunches of dried herbs like rattles. The music swelled playful, yet oddly solemn, as if it reminded everyone that even humble objects had their secret voices. The emperor closed his eyes and thought a spoon does not only serve the mouth, it also serves the ear, the hand, the spirit. It is not only for food, but for rhythm, for memory, for joy. By the end of the evening, when the last note faded and silence returned, the emperor felt content. He no longer thought of the missing silver spoon as an absence. Instead, he thought of it as an unseen conductor guiding all the humble spoons and bowls to speak. And so he went to bed that night with the faint ringing of wooden spoons in his ears and the thought that perhaps life itself was always a little orchestra if one only stopped to listen. The taste of hunger. Morning drifted softly into the palace with sunlight filtering through latticed windows like spilled honey. The emperor awoke not to the scent of food, but to the quiet emptiness of a room where no trays had yet arrived. His first thought was not of porridge, nor of bread, nor of fruit. It was of the absence of his silver spoon. It had been gone for many days now, and though the palace had adjusted in small ways, the lack had grown into a strange kind of presence, like a polite but insistent guest who never leaves. This morning, however, another absence was felt. Breakfast came late, and when at last it did, the trays carried little more than thin broth and half loaves of bread, baked pale and stretched from scant flour. The emperor sat quietly and tasted the broth. It was hot, watery, and nearly flavorless, yet he did not frown. Hunger has its own taste, and he found himself wondering whether the missing spoon had been preparing him for this moment all along, to eat with less, to learn from absence. In the kitchens below, the cooks whispered anxiously. The granaries were thinning. The latest caravans had not yet arrived. A drought had touched distant fields. The loss of the emperor's spoon had been a palace curiosity, but the loss of abundance was something heavier. One bold cook murmured, perhaps the gods began by taking a spoon to teach us how to endure the loss of fuller things. Another replied, or perhaps the spoon left on its own, knowing it was not needed when there is so little to stir. The emperor, seated at his table, imagined he could hear their words echoing faintly up through stone corridor. He smiled at the thought. Later that day, he wandered the palace gardens. They were less lush than before. The gardeners worked carefully, coaxing green life from stubborn soil. Even the fruit trees seemed hesitant, offering fewer figs and pomegranates. The emperor paused beside a tree and thought about spoons again. A spoon, after all, was shaped to carry food with gentleness, not to seize or grasp. It was a vessel of patience. Perhaps hunger, too, was a kind of spoon hollow, waiting to be filled yet dignified in its shape. He bent to pick up a fallen fig leaf. Curled and dry, it looked almost like a spoon itself, scooped by nature's own design. He held it up and laughed quietly. Even hunger has its tools, he said to no one in particular. When dinner came, it was humble: a clay bowl of lentils boiled until soft, a crust of bread rough and dark. The emperor dipped his simple wooden spoon and found to his surprise that the lentils tasted more vivid than usual. Hunger, like a hidden cook, had seasoned them. Around him, courtiers shifted uneasily, unused to such plain fare. Some picked delicately as if ashamed, others ate quickly as if to outrun their own hunger. The emperor, however, ate slowly. He thought about how food fills the body, but absence fills the mind. Both are needed, though neither lasts. That night before sleep, he walked barefoot across the stone floor, his steps echoing in the quiet chamber. He imagined his missing silver spoon wandering somewhere, perhaps lying forgotten in a dusty corner, or perhaps embarking on a grand journey of its own. Wherever you are, he whispered, you have taught me that emptiness too can be tasted, and sometimes it tastes like truth. With that, he lay down, hunger humming softly in his belly like a distant drum. Yet his heart was full, and he drifted peacefully into dreams. Nice. Mazam. The feast after fasting, the palace had been quiet for several days, not gloomy exactly, but hushed in a way that made the sound of a ladle against a pot seem like a bell rung in a temple. Meals had been plain and spare broth, with little floating in it, bread without honey fruits, reduced to a single fig, passed from hand to hand. Hunger had become a companion, not fierce but present, reminding everyone of their own fragility. And then, as if a secret door had been opened, abundance arrived again. The kitchens bustled before dawn. Smoke rose from the great ovens, pots rattled, herbs crackled in oil, and the long wooden tables groaned under trays of lamb, baskets of olives, piles of cucumbers and dates shining with syrup. After weeks of restraint, the cooks seemed to take delight in excess. Even the scullions, usually thin with fatigue, licked their lips as they carried trays high above their heads. The emperor walked barefoot through the kitchen that morning. His silver spoon, the one that had set this strange adventure into motion, was still nowhere to be found, yet his absence of spoon no longer seemed tragic. It had become something like an old riddle, unsolved, yes, but pleasant to revisit now and then. He looked at the steaming breads, the roasted meats, the sweets glazed with honey, and smiled. So the table grows fat again, he said softly. A cook, elbow deep in dough, bowed flour, puffing into the air like incense. By midday, the great hall shone with light. Sunlight poured through high windows, catching the gleam of polished brass bowls and the dark sheen of jugs filled with wine. The courtiers gathered their silks, rustling eyes wide at the sight of plenty after days of thin fare. The emperor took his place at the head of the table. Before him lay not a silver spoon, nor even the humble clay one he had carried recently, but a simple wooden spoon carved by a palace carpenter. It was plain, smooth, and light in his hand. He lifted it and examined the grain of the wood, almost as though it were the first time he had ever truly seen a spoon. When the feast began, voices rose like birdsong. Laughter returned to the hall. Plates clattered, wine sloshed, and hands reached across the table. The emperor ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a lesson: the softness of bread, the sharpness of garlic, the sweetness of melon. And he noticed something. The hunger of the past days had changed the taste of the food. Where before a roasted bird was merely one dish among many, now each bite seemed almost miraculous. Absence had given presence its flavor. He raised his cup and spoke, not loudly, not in a proclamation, but gently enough that the room fell quiet to listen. Hunger, it seems, is its own spoon, he said. It teaches us how to hold food properly, how to lift it into the mouth of the soul. Without hunger, even a silver spoon is dull. With hunger, even a wooden spoon is noble. The courtiers nodded some, with mouths full, some pausing in thought. They had felt this too, though none had named it. The feast continued, a river of courses flowing past stews, fruits, cheeses, sweets. The emperor ate, but never hurried. At one point, he set down the wooden spoon and took a piece of bread in his hand, tearing it, dipping it into oil. He thought how little difference there was between utensils and fingers, between vessels and emptiness. What mattered was the savor itself and the company that shared it. By evening, the tables were messy with crumbs and empty jugs. Courtiers reclined in contentment, eyes half closed, bellies full. The emperor rose and walked barefoot from the hall. The stones of the corridor were cool beneath his feet, a contrast to the warmth in his body. He thought of the missing silver spoon. Once its loss had seemed a puzzle to be solved. Now it felt more like a teacher who had simply stepped away after finishing the lesson. That night, he lay in bed, not with the weight of a full stomach, but with the lightness of gratitude. The feast had not erased the hunger, but rather completed it. He drifted to sleep, imagining a silver spoon wandering the world, slipping into kitchens here and there, reminding people of absence so that they might better taste abundance. The emperor walks among the townsfolk. The morning sun stretched over the palace walls and poured into the city beyond, as if it too were curious about how things went on outside the marbled courtyards. The emperor, who still had not recovered his silver spoon, rose with the feeling that the palace, for all its polish, was beginning to echo with too much reflection. He decided that day to step outside the walls and into the streets of his people. It was not unusual for an emperor to be carried through the avenues in a litter shaded by canopies and fanned by servants, but this morning he preferred to walk. His courtiers whispered nervously, an emperor wandering the streets with no ceremony, no spoon at his belt, no sign of distinction except the simple robe he wore. Yet he was insistent. Perhaps the absence of the spoon had given him a taste for other absences, such as the absence of distance between himself and his people. So he set out. The streets were alive with the sound of mourning women bargaining for vegetables, children chasing each other with little wooden toys, a fishmonger calling out his prices, and the steady tap tap of a cobbler hammering leather. Dust rose where carts rolled. It was a city like any other, yet to the emperor it felt different, as though the missing spoon had opened a new chamber of perception in him. The townsfolk, of course, noticed. Not every day did they see their ruler wandering about, looking at bread loaves and herbs, nodding thoughtfully at clay jars. At first, many bowed, confused, but the emperor smiled gently and told them, "Today I walk as one among you. No throne, no silver spoon, only feet dust and eyes." Some laughed, others were bewildered. A few seemed relieved, as if it were easier to recognize their emperor barefoot in the dust of daily life than sitting high on polished marble. He came upon a baker setting flatbreads to cool on a wooden shelf. The emperor paused to watch the steam rise, and the baker, flustered, offered him one. The emperor took it in his hands and broke it, eating slowly, remarking, "It is warm. Warmth itself is a kind of utensil. It carries flavor to the heart." The baker blinked, not quite sure what to reply, and finally muttered that the emperor spoke kindly of simple things. Further along, the emperor sat by a group of children who had fashioned spoons of mud, letting them dry in the sun. They pretended to eat from them, making exaggerated slurping sounds. The emperor asked if he might borrow one of these crumbly spoons, and the children giggled as he solemnly held it, pretending to taste invisible broth. Not sturdy, he admitted, but full of imagination. And imagination is a finer seasoning than salt. The children squealed with delight, proud that their emperor had joined their game. Later he paused at the well, where women filled their jars. One, bold enough to speak, asked, "Is it true, Majesty, that you have lost your silver spoon? It is true, the emperor replied without embarrassment, but I have found many spoons since, wooden, clay, bronze, even those shaped of air and play. Perhaps the silver one was only a beginning. The women nodded, murmuring to each other, and one said, "Then may your meals always be seasoned with what is near, not only what is rare." The emperor bowed as though to a teacher. By the time the sun leaned westward, his sandals were powdered with dust, and his robe smelled faintly of smoke from the cook fires he had lingered beside. Yet his heart was light. He had eaten bread from a baker's shelf, played with children in the dirt, spoken with women at the well, and tasted the closeness of his people in ways no ceremony could provide. When he returned to the palace gates, the courtiers gathered anxiously, searching for signs of insult or dishonor, but the emperor carried nothing except a chipped clay cup a villager had pressed into his hand, and a smile that seemed to carry both dust and delight. That evening, as he sat in the quiet of his chamber, he set the clay cup on the table beside his empty bowl. He did not miss the silver spoon quite so much. In its absence, he had found warmth, play, humility, and humanity. Perhaps the spoon had gone missing, not to deprive him, but to guide him. The palace walls seemed a little less confining that night, and when he closed his eyes, he dreamt not of silver, but of laughter dust and bread that tasted of the sun. Bread and the missing spoon, the morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that draped itself over the palace like a light blanket. The emperor rose slowly still without his silver spoon, which by now felt less like a loss and more like an old friend who had wandered off on a long errand. He had learned not to scold its absence. Instead, he wondered each day what lesson the spoon might be teaching him by staying hidden. On this particular morning, his feet carried him gently, deliberately toward the temple kitchens. The smell had reached him before the place itself, warm, earthy, and comforting, like the very scent of life. Bread was being baked. The temple kitchens were busy, but not frantic. They were orderly in that special way. Kitchens sometimes are firewood stacked neatly, loaves cooling in long rows, clay jars lined like soldiers awaiting honey or oil. The bakers bowed deeply when the emperor entered, though. Flour dust rose in little clouds from their aprons so that their bows looked like puffs of white smoke. Majesty, said the head baker, an old man with arms stronger than some soldiers, though his strength had been built not from swords, but from kneading dough. We are honored. Would you taste today's bread? The emperor smiled. He had always eaten bread, of course everyone did, but today he looked at it differently. Without his spoon, he had learned to notice things more directly. Bread, he thought, was itself a kind of spoon, a vessel that carried flavors, that scooped up oils, honey beans, or broth, a spoon of wheat and patience. The bakers placed before him a warm loaf. Its crust was brown and crackling. Its interior steamed softly when torn open. He cupped it in both hands, no utensils needed, and for a moment felt a surprising kinship with farmers, millers, bakers, priests, and children, every hand that had touched wheat on its long journey from seed to loaf. He took a bite. The bread was plain, but in its plainness lay dignity. It reminded him that while spoons were shaped by craftsmen, bread was shaped by the earth itself, with only the encouragement of water, fire, and patient hands. The bakers watched in silence as though waiting for a decree, but the emperor only chewed slowly, then said, "Bread is a sermon in itself. It teaches us patience. It reminds us that nourishment does not require ornament." The bakers relaxed their floury faces, breaking into soft smiles. As the emperor lingered, he asked to see the process from the beginning. They showed him the grinding stones, heavy and worn, where grain was slowly coaxed into fine flour. They showed him jars of yeast alive and bubbling like a quiet community, whispering among themselves. They showed him ovens that glowed with embers, steady and faithful. The emperor thought a spoon carries food to the mouth, bread carries food to the soul. He remembered how priests had spoken of bread as sacred, how loaves were left in temples for the gods, as though even divinity required a daily meal. He thought too of how children in the town he had visited shaped mud spoons with their fingers, and how bread torn and shared was itself a kind of communal spoon. That afternoon, the emperor ate with the bakers. No ceremony, no banquet hall, no polished vessels, just loaves torn open and passed from hand to hand, dipped in oil, touched by salt. And he realized something. Though his silver spoon was absent, he had never felt so present. Later, when he left the kitchen, he carried with him a single loaf wrapped in cloth. He held it carefully as though it were treasure. Perhaps it was. That night, he placed the loaf on the small table beside his bed, where once the silver spoon had rested. Its scent lingered as he drifted into sleep, a reminder that sometimes what we lose shows us how to cherish what we already hold. The Emperor's cup. The silver spoon had been gone long enough now that the palace no longer bustled in panic. Servants still whispered about it sometimes, as if the spoon had slipped out of the kitchen to take a small holiday, but the Emperor himself had grown used to its absence. Instead, his attention drifted elsewhere toward the companions of bread, wine, beer, and water. Bread, he had learned, could stand alone as food and symbol alike, yet bread without drink seemed strangely incomplete. A spoon without a bowl was unfinished. Bread without drink was equally so. So the emperor thought about drink. In the cool courtyard of the palace brewery, he watched the workers mash soaked barley with long wooden paddles. The air smelled sweet and sour, like a mixture of honey and earth left too long in the sun. The brewer explained the process. Water from the canal's barley, softened, mashed, left to rest, then strained into jars that would froth and settle into beer. The emperor nodded gently. Beer, he thought, was not unlike the spoon itself, humble, common, not always refined, but present in nearly every household. Beer fills the belly when food is scarce, the brewer said, wiping his brow. It comforts the worker after the field. It steadies the soldier before battle. It is not polished silver, but it is steady wood. The emperor liked this. A silver spoon was dignified, but a clay cup could carry the same comfort. Later, he visited the vineyards at the edge of the city. Their rows of vines spread like green rivers under the sun. Slaves and servants pressed the grapes in wide vats, their bare feet squelching and staining purple. Some laughed at the ticklish sensation. Others sang work songs. The juice ran red into jars later to become wine. Wine is not like beer, the vintner explained. It is rarer, slower to make. It is for the gods, the nobles, the feasts. Beer belongs to the field. Wine belongs to the temple and the palace. The emperor swirled a cup of fresh wine, its taste sharp and sweet. Wine was not so humble it reminded him of the silver spoon, refined, ceremonial, sometimes unnecessary, but beautiful all the same. Wine was a thing that turned an ordinary meal into an event, as silver turned a lump of broth into a gesture. In the evening, the emperor sat beside the river. He cupped cool water in his palm, sipping it directly, and thought water was the truest of them all. Beer comforted, wine adorned, but water simply was. It refreshed without ceremony, the same way a wooden spoon could deliver a meal without flourish. Bread and drink, spoon and bowl, presence and absence. He closed his eyes, thinking of the missing spoon. Perhaps it had not vanished, but merely gone wandering, as he now wandered in thought. Maybe it had traveled to remind him that not all nourishment was about polished silver or perfect form. A chipped clay cup could carry sweetness. A bare hand could lift water. That night in his dream, the emperor walked barefoot through a vineyard. Grapes hung heavy around him, and in the middle of the rows stood his missing silver spoon, planted upright in the soil like a vine itself. From its handle sprouted leaves, and from its bowl dripped wine, then beer, then clear water. He reached to touch it, but the spoon only smiled if spoons can smile, and whispered, You do not need me to drink. The emperor awoke smiling. The spoon was still absent, but he no longer felt thirst for it. His cup, whatever its shape, was always full. The music of the missing spoon. The palace was unusually lively that evening. After days of reflection and meals eaten with clay or wooden spoons, the emperor found himself surrounded by musicians and dancers preparing for a festival of music. The courtyards flickered with lamplight, the air carried the perfume of night blooming flowers, and the soft pluck of a lute drifted through the corridors like a bird that had somehow lost its way but decided to stay. The emperor, as was his habit, since the disappearance of his silver spoon, walked slowly, smiling, faintly unhurried. Where once he might have sat upon his gilded chair with polished tableware, he now lingered near the edges of things listening, watching, tasting the quiet between the notes. The musicians tuned their instruments, harps with strings of gut and bronze flutes carved from reeds and hand drums stretched tight with skins. But the servants, catching the mood of improvisation that the missing spoon had cast over the palace, had brought other instruments as well: wooden ladles, copper bowls, pestles from the kitchen things that were never meant to make music, but suddenly did when struck or tapped or shaken. At first, it seemed absurd, a cook gently knocking a bronze pot with a spoon, though not the silver one, of course, a scullion boy tapping rhythm on the side of a clay water jar. Yet soon the sounds blended. The noble harp gave dignity, the reed flute gave sweetness, but the clatter of spoons and ladles gave humor, warmth, and something very human. The emperor closed his eyes. He heard in the mixture not chaos, but order, like a reminder that the universe does not draw straight lines, yet it has its own rhythm. He thought, a silver spoon makes no sound when it stirs broth, but when lost, it sets the whole palace ringing. The dancers entered the courtyard, their bare feet slapping gently against the stone. The music guided them, though sometimes the rhythm slipped and became irregular. No one minded. The crookedness of the beat only made the dancing more alive, as though each dancer's foot was itself an instrument answering the drums and bowls. The emperor laughed softly, an unusual sound, for him low and genuine. He realized that in his silver spoon he had always sought refinement, balance, control, but in its absence he had found rhythm, play, and surprise. The spoon had taught him not by being present, but by being missing. Later that night, as the lamps burned low and the courtyard emptied, the emperor remained seated on a plain stool. A wooden ladle rested in his lap. He turned it slowly in his hands, noticing how worn the handle was, how it still smelled faintly of onions and garlic. It had fed mouths, stirred soups, and now it had made music. Perhaps, he murmured to himself, the true spoon is not silver or clay or wood. It is anything that bridges emptiness and fullness, silence and sound. When he finally retired to his chamber, the music still lingered in his ears. He felt as though the missing spoon had joined the orchestra that evening, playing invisibly, quietly, reminding him that loss itself can become a kind of song. And in that soft music of absence, the emperor drifted peacefully into sleep. The spoon that was never truly lost, morning, came as it always did, with the sun nudging its way across the palace walls, spilling soft light into the emperor's chamber. He sat quietly at his table, the place where for so many years the silver spoon had rested beside his bowl. The place was still empty. At first, weeks ago, it had felt like a wound, a missing tooth in the smile of his mornings. Now the absence had become a kind of companion, like an old friend who spoke not with words, but with silence. The emperor rested his hand on the polished wood of the table, so he murmured, another day without you. He thought of all the spoons that had come into his life since that peculiar morning when the silver one disappeared. A humble wooden spoon, light as a reed, a clay spoon, rough and chipped, but oddly dignified, a bronze spoon that caught the glint of torchlight like a tiny piece of the sun, even no spoon at all, when hunger had taught him that the bowl itself was sometimes enough. Each had offered a lesson, a reminder that no object, however fine, held the power to make life meaningful on its own. It was the hands that held it, the lips that tasted from it, the people who sat across the table. The palace had changed too. Courtiers no longer whispered anxiously about the missing spoon. Instead, they shared their meals with lighter hearts, sometimes laughing when the emperor arrived with a new utensil in hand. The kitchens rang not only with pots and pans, but with music because someone had discovered that a ladle struck on a copper bowl made a note that lingered like a bell. In temples, priests spoke not of loss, but of symbols, how a spoon could be like a bridge between hunger and gratitude, presence and absence. And the emperor found himself smiling when he heard them because he no longer needed to be told. That morning, he chose a wooden spoon from the kitchen, nothing special, just smoothed by years of stirring porridge. He dipped it into his bowl and tasted his breakfast. It was ordinary, but good. After he had eaten, he walked into the gardens. Children were playing by the fountain, and one of them held up a small mud spoon shaped roughly by hand and drying in the sun. The emperor bent down to admire it. "It is a fine spoon," he said gravely. The child grinned proud. The emperor knew then that the silver spoon was never truly gone. It had scattered itself into 100 forms, into clay, wood, bronze, mud, and memory. It had become laughter in the dining hall, music in the kitchens, reflections in temple lamps, even silence at an empty table. That evening, as the stars trembled into the sky, he sat once more by his table. He did not place a spoon beside the bowl. He did not need to, for in the quiet he realized a spoon is only a shape for holding, but what it holds, hunger, sweetness, memory, joy, was always there with or without silver. And so the emperor closed his eyes, the day's lessons settling gently around him like a blanket. Somewhere, perhaps, the silver spoon still rested tucked away in shadows, or perhaps it had walked off into legend carrying with it a little gleam of wisdom. It did not matter. The emperor had learned that nothing precious is ever truly lost, only changed, only waiting to be found in new forms. With that thought, he drifted into sleep, his dreams quiet and full.